Amelia Edwards, The Phantom Coach. The chief merit of the story you are about to hear from me is its truth. It is a narrative of events in my own life, and I remember them as clearly as if they had happened only yesterday. Yet, 20 years have already passed since that night. In all those 20 years, I have told this story to only one person, and it cost me a great effort now to force myself to repeat it. All I ask is that you do not force your own interpretations upon me. I need no explanations, and I wish to hear no arguments. I have formed quite a definite opinion of what occurred, based on the evidence of my own senses, and I prefer to abide by it. Well then, it was exactly 20 years ago. In a day or two, the hunting season was coming to an end. I had spent the entire day with my gun in hand, but my bag was next to nothing. The wind was from the east, the time was December, and the setting was a heather-covered moorland in the far north of England. And I was lost. What a fitting environment I had chosen for such a mishap. A blizzard was approaching. The first fluffy flakes were already fluttering in the air. The leaden twilight was deepening. I shaded my eyes with my hand and began to peer anxiously into the darkening distance, where, some 10 or 12 miles away, the carpet of heather gave way to low hills. And nowhere around was there a sign of smoke, a fence, or a sheep track. Nothing was left for me but to walk forward in the hope of stumbling upon some kind of shelter. I shouldered my gun once more and trudged onward with the last of my strength, for I had not been able to sit down since morning, and not a single morsel of food had passed my lips all day. Meanwhile, the wind died down, and the snow began to fall with an ominous regularity. Following this, the cold intensified. I was coming on fast. The sky grew bleaker, and so did my prospects. My heart sank when I thought of my young wife. How she, waiting for me, would not leave the window of the little inn where we were staying, and what agonizing anxieties lay ahead of her in this long night. We had been married 4 months ago, had spent the autumn in the highlands of northern Scotland, and had now stopped in a remote English village, right on the border of the vast heather wastes. We were deeply in love and, needless to say, very happy. This morning, when we parted, she begged me to return before dark, and I had promised her. What would I not have given to keep my word? Even now, despite my exhaustion, I felt that I might still manage to return before midnight, if only I could find supper and shelter somewhere, rest for an hour, and hire a guide. In the meantime, the snow kept falling, and the darkness of the night grew thicker. Every few steps I would stop and shout, but the silence that followed seemed even deeper. Then, a vague uneasiness stole over me, and I began to recall stories of travelers who walked on in a snowstorm until fatigue overcame them, and they lay down and fell asleep, never to wake again. Can I stay on my feet through all this long, dark night? I asked myself, will there not come a moment when my strength fails and my resolve weakens, and when I, too, will fall asleep forever? I shuddered. How terrible it is to die right now, when life seems so beautiful. How terrible for my beloved, for she, with all her heart. But away with these thoughts. To banish them, I began to shout again, even louder than before, and then listened intently. Did an answering cry sound in the distance, or did I imagine it? I shouted once more, and again the echo answered me. Then, out of the darkness, a flickering speck of light suddenly appeared. It shifted, vanished, and approached again, growing larger and brighter. I ran headlong toward it and, to my intense joy, found myself face to face with an old man carrying a lantern. "Thank God!" escaped my lips involuntarily. He raised his lantern and, squinting, looked grimly into my face. "What for?" he muttered surlily. "Why for you? I was afraid I should perish here in the snow. Many a man has perished here already. Why shouldn't you perish if it be God's will? If it be God's will that we perish together, then so be it. But without you, my friend, I have no intention of perishing here. How many miles is it from here to Dwolding?" "A good 20 or thereabouts." "And to the nearest village?" "The nearest village is Wyke, and it is 12 miles in the other direction." "Well, and where do you live yourself?" "Over there." He gave a slight jerk of the hand that held the lantern. You're going home now, I suppose? Maybe I am. Then I'm going with you. The old man shook his head and, in deep thought, rubbed his nose with the handle of the lantern. It is no use trying, he muttered. He will never let you in. I know him. Well, we shall see about that, I replied briskly. And who is he? The master. And who is he? That is no business of yours, came the blunt reply. Well, you lead the way, and I shall see to it that I get a roof over my head and some supper. Catch him doing it, muttered my companion, who was now, willy-nilly, forced to become my guide. Still shaking his head, he began to hobble away through the snowfall, looking very much like a gnome. Soon, a large, vague mass loomed before us in the darkness, and a huge dog rushed toward us with a furious bark. Is that the house? I asked. The very one. Down, bang. And the old man began to fumble in his pockets, searching for the keys. I stepped up close to him, so as not to miss the opportunity to slip inside. In the circle of light from the lantern, I saw that the door was thickly studded with iron spikes, like a prison gate. In the next instant, he turned the key in the lock, and I squeezed past him through the doorway. Once inside, I looked around with curiosity. I found myself in a large hall with a wooden ceiling. To all appearances, it was used for a great variety of purposes. In one corner, as if in a barn, a heap of grain rose up to the very ceiling. In another, there were piled sacks of flour, agricultural implements, casks, and all kinds of lumber. From the ceiling beams hung rows of hams, large pieces of salted pork, and bunches of dried herbs, stored for the winter. In the center stood some large object, wrapped in a coarse, dingy cloth cover. In height, it reached halfway to the rafters of the roof. I lifted the edge of the cover and was astonished. Beneath it was a large telescope, mounted on a movable platform with 4 wheels. The tube of the telescope was made of painted wood and bound with rough metal hoops. The reflector, as far as I could distinguish in the dim light, was at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was examining this instrument and wondering whether it might be the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. "That is for you," said my guide with a grim smile. "There is his room." He pointed to a low, dark door on the opposite side of the hall. I crossed the floor, knocked loudly, and entered without waiting for an invitation. From behind a table piled high with books and papers, a gray-haired old man of gigantic stature rose and spoke in a harsh tone. "Who are you? How did you get here? What do you want?" "James Murray, barrister. On foot from Dwolding. Food, drink, and a night's lodging." The old man knitted his thick brows threateningly. "My house is not an inn," he said haughtily. "Jacob, how dared you let a stranger in?" "I didn't let him in," the other grumbled. He followed close at my heels, pushed me aside, and forced his way into the house. I am no match for him. He stands 6 feet 2 inches, if he is an inch. "Be so good as to explain, sir, by what right you have broken into my house by force." "By the same right by which I should cling to your boat if I were drowning. By the right of self-preservation." "Self-preservation," I replied briefly. "The snow is already an inch deep, and by morning there will be enough of it to bury my corpse completely." He went to the window, drew back a heavy dark curtain, and looked out. "True," he agreed. "If you wish, you may remain until morning. Jacob brings supper." He signed for me to take a seat, sat down himself, and once more plunged into the occupations I had interrupted. I placed my gun in the corner, drew a chair up to the fireplace, and leisurely surveyed the room. This room was smaller than the hall and not so cluttered, yet it contained much that excited my curiosity. The floor was bare, without carpets. The whitewashed walls were here and there scrawled with mysterious diagrams, and in other places lined with shelves groaning under the weight of various scientific instruments, for the most part of an unknown purpose to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dusty folios. On the other, a small organ, whimsically decorated with colored images of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-open door of a cabinet at the far end of the room, I could see an extensive collection of minerals, surgical instruments, crucibles, retorts, and laboratory glassware. On the mantelpiece beside me stood, among other things, a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. There was something lying on every chair. In every corner piled a mountain of books. Even the floor was strewn with maps, plaster casts, papers, charts, and all kinds of imaginable and unimaginable scholarly litter. I looked around with an amazement that grew as my gaze shifted from one random object to another. It was the first time I had ever seen such an extraordinary room, but it was even more astonishing to discover it in a lonely farmhouse in these wild, desolate parts. Again and again, I turned my eyes from the master of the house to his surroundings and back, wondering who he was and what he did. His head was remarkably beautiful, but it was rather the head of a poet than of a natural scientist. Broad at the temples, with prominent brow ridges, and crowned with a mass of stiff, completely white hair, this head, in its ideal outlines and partly in its massiveness, reminded me of the head of Ludwig van Beethoven. There were the same deep lines around the mouth, the same stern wrinkles on the forehead, the same expression of intense concentration. While I was studying this man, the door opened and Jacob brought in supper. The master of the house shut his book, rose, and with more courtesy than he had shown hitherto, invited me to the table. Before me was a dish of ham and eggs, a large loaf of black bread, and a bottle of excellent sherry. "I have nothing to offer you, sir, but the simplest country fare," the host lamented. "I hope your appetite will help you reconcile yourself to the poverty of our larder." I had already fallen upon the food, and, protesting vigorously with the enthusiasm of a starved hunter, began to assure him that I had never tasted anything more delicious in my life. The host bowed stiffly and began his own supper, which consisted merely of a pitcher of milk and a bowl of oatmeal. We ate in silence. When we had finished, Jacob carried away the tray. I drew my chair back to the fire. The master, to my surprise, did the same, and turning sharply to me, said, "Sir, I have lived here in absolute retirement for 23 years. In all that time, I have scarcely ever met with strangers, and I have never once held a newspaper in my hands. You are the first unfamiliar person to cross the threshold of my house in more than 4 years. Will you be so good as to give me some account of the outer world, with which I have so long broken off all connection?" "Please, ask your questions," I replied. "I am heartily glad to serve you." He bowed his head in acknowledgment, then rested his chin upon his hands, fixed his gaze on the fire in the grate, and began his inquiries. His inquiries were directed, in the first instance, to science. He knew next to nothing of how the latest scientific achievements were being applied in practical life. I am no man of science, and I answered to the best of my scanty knowledge. But the task was by no means easy, and I breathed a sigh of relief when my companion turned from questioning to commenting, and began to express his own views upon the facts with which I had tried to make him acquainted. He spoke, and I listened as if spellbound. He scarcely seemed to remember my presence. It was a monologue of thinking aloud. I had never heard anything like it. Familiar with all schools of philosophy, subtle in analysis, bold in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in a continuous stream. Without changing his bent posture and never taking his eyes from the fire, he passed from topic to topic, from argument to argument, like an inspired dreamer. From applied sciences to philosophy, from electricity in wires to electricity in man, from Mesmer to Reichenbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, to the Magi and mystics of the East. These transitions astounded by their variety and scope, yet in his mouth they sounded as simple and harmonious as music. Gradually, I cannot remember what chain of reasoning preceded it, he passed into that region which oversteps the boundaries of even the boldest philosophy and extends into the unknown. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its capacities, of clairvoyance, of prophecy, of all those phenomena which are termed spirits, ghosts, or apparitions, in whose existence throughout all ages many have believed, while skeptics denied them. People, he argued, are less and less inclined to believe in anything that lies beyond the limits of their own very narrow sphere of concepts, and men of science encourage this fatal tendency. They call everything a fable that does not admit of experimental investigation. Whatever cannot be studied in a laboratory or on an anatomical table, they reject as a forgery. Against what other superstition have they waged so long and fierce a war as against the belief in apparitions? And yet, what other superstition has taken so deep and lasting a root in the minds of men? Point out to me any universally recognized fact in physics, history, or archaeology that is confirmed by such numerous and varied testimonies. And this phenomenon, known to men of all races, in all historical periods, in every corner of the earth, to everyone from the famous sages of antiquity to the most primitive savages living in our day, to Christians, pagans, and materialists, modern philosophers call it old wives' tales. The most circumstantial evidence turns to dust upon their scales. The comparison of cause and effect, a method used in physics, is rejected here as unworthy of attention. The testimony of reliable witnesses, which in a court of law is regarded as a decisive argument, counts for nothing here. A man who thinks before he utters a single word is called an empty babbler. A man who believes is classed among dreamers or fools. He said this with bitterness. For a few minutes he was silent. Then he raised his head and spoke in an altered voice. And I thought, I investigated, I believed, and I was not afraid to speak my judgments aloud. And I, like others, was branded a visionary. I was ridiculed by my contemporaries and driven from the field of science, where I had labored with honor through all the best years of my life. That happened exactly 23 years ago. You see how I live now. So have I lived all these years. The world has forgotten me, and I have forgotten the world. There's my story for you. A very sad story. I murmured, finding no other answer. The commonest story. I have suffered for the truth, as many have suffered before me who were better and wiser. He rose, evidently not wishing to pursue the conversation, and walked to the window. The snow has ceased, he remarked, drew the curtain, and returned to the fireside. Ceased, I exclaimed, starting to my feet in impatience. If only it were possible. But no, it is hopeless. Even if I could find the way, to walk 20 miles before the night is over is beyond my strength now. Walk 20 miles before night, the master of the house repeated. What has put that into your head? My wife, I replied, anxiously. My wife does not know that I am lost, and she must be driven half-mad with anxiety by now. And where is she? At Dwolding, 20 miles from here. At Dwolding, he repeated in contemplation. Yes, true, it is 20 miles. But are you so eager to get there that you cannot wait 6 or 8 hours? Very eager. I would gladly give 10 guineas this moment for a guide and a horse. It may cost you much less than that, he said with a smile. The North Mail coach stops at Dwolding tonight to change horses. It passes within 5 miles of this place. In about an hour and a quarter, it should be at the crossroads. If Jacob were to guide you across the moor to the old road, you could, I think, find your way to the point where it joins the new one. Nothing could be easier. That is wonderful. He smiled again, rang the bell, gave his orders to the old servant, and then took a bottle of whiskey and a glass from the cupboard where the chemicals were kept, saying, The snow is deep, it will be hard walking. A glass of Scotch whiskey for the road. I would have declined the spirit, but he insisted, and I drank it. The liquid burned my throat like liquid fire. It quite took my breath away. The whiskey is strong, but now the frost will be nothing to you. And now lose no time. Good night. I thanked him for his hospitality and wished to shake his hand, but he turned away before I could finish my sentence. A moment later, I crossed the hall. Jacob locked the house door behind me, and we found ourselves upon a vast, empty space, white with snow. The wind had fallen, but despite this, it was intensely cold. Not a single star was visible in the black sky. Not a sound was around us. Only the crunching of the snow beneath our feet broke the heavy silence of the night. Jacob, by no means delighted with his errand, hobbled ahead in sullen silence, a lantern in his hands, a shadow at his feet. I strode behind him, my gun shouldered. I had no more desire to talk than he did. My mind was entirely occupied with the man in whose house I had just been. His voice still rang in my ears. His eloquence still held sway over my imagination. It is strange, but I remember to this day how whole sentences and fragments of phrases, successions of brilliant images, and the exact words of his subtlest arguments kept flashing through my overwrought brain. Pondering over what I had heard and trying to supply the lost links in his chain of reasoning, I followed close at the heels of my guide, wrapped in my own thoughts and deaf to everything around me. It seemed to me that about 5 minutes had passed, no more, when Jacob suddenly stopped and said, "Here is the road. Keep to the right hand of the stone fence, and you cannot go wrong." "So this is the old road?" "The very same. And is it far yet to the crossroads?" "Near upon 3 miles." I took out my purse, and Jacob's tongue was loosened at once. "The road is well enough for a man on foot, but it is over-narrow and steep for coaches. You will see, ahead by the post, the wall is broken down. It has never been mended since the accident happened." "What accident?" "The mail coach overturned into the valley one night, fell a good 50 feet, or even more. It is the worst bit of road in the whole county." "How awful! How many lives were lost?" "All of them, when they were found, for were already dead, and the other 2 died the next morning." "And when did this happen?" "Just 9 years ago today." "Near the post, you say?" "I shall remember that. Good night." "Good night, sir, and thank you." Jacob dropped his half-a-crown in his pocket, touched his hat slightly, and trudged back the way he came. I did not lose sight of the light of his lantern until it completely vanished. Then I turned and continued my journey alone. It was not all difficult now. Although the sky was as black as soot, the outlines of the stone fence were clearly visible against the faint glimmer of the snow. What a stillness reigned around. Only the crunch of my footsteps and no other sound. What silence and what loneliness! A strange, melancholy feeling began to take possession of me. I quickened my pace. I began to hum a fragment of some tune. I imagined myself the master of immense sums of money and began to calculate compound interest upon them in my head. In short, I did everything possible to forget those startling theories I had lately been forced to hear, and to some extent I succeeded. The night air, meanwhile, was growing colder and colder, and though I walked fast, I could not keep myself warm. My feet were as cold as ice. My hands lost all sensibility and mechanically clutched my gun. I even began to gasp for breath, as though I were not walking along a gentle road in the north of England, but climbing the steepest peak of the Alps. This so distressed me that I was forced to stop for a moment and lean against the stone fence. Looking back by chance, I noticed, to my immense relief, a distant light like the approaching gleam of a lantern. At first, I thought Jacob was returning, but then I saw a second light moving parallel to the first at the same speed. It was easy to guess that these were the lamps of a carriage, though it was strange that anyone should choose to venture out upon a road so obviously deserted and dangerous. Yet, the fact remained. The lights grew and became brighter with every moment, and I even fancied I could already distinguish the outlines of a coach between them. It advanced very rapidly and in perfect silence. That was understandable enough, for the depth of the snow beneath the wheels was near upon 1 foot. When the carriage behind the lamps was plainly visible, it appeared to me suspiciously high. Suddenly a suspicion flashed through my mind. What if I had already passed the crossroads without noticing the post in the dark? And what if this was the very mail coach I needed? I had no time to puzzle over this question, for at that same instant the coach rounded a bend in the road. The guard, the coachman, an outside passenger, and a team of 4 gray horses from which steam was rising. I saw all this in a cloud of light, in which, like 2 fiery meteors, the lamps blazed. I waved my hat and rushed forward with a shout. The mail coach dashed past at full speed. I was terrified that they had not noticed me, but in the next second, I was convinced of the contrary. The coachman pulled up the horses. The guard, wrapped in a hooded cloak and muffled in a scarf up to his very eyes, made no answer to my call and did not even stir, let alone leap to the ground. He had evidently fallen fast asleep to the motion of the carriage. The outside passenger did not turn his head either. I opened the door myself, slipped into an empty seat, and congratulated myself on my good fortune. Inside the coach, it seemed to me It was even colder than outside, if such a thing were possible, and for some reason, it smelled unpleasantly of dampness. I looked at my companions. They proved to be 3 men. All were silent. They did not look as if they were asleep, but each had shrunk into his own corner and seemed buried in thought. I attempted to start a conversation. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I began, addressing the passenger who sat opposite to me. He raised his head, looked at me, but answered nothing. "It seems that winter has set in earnest," I continued. The corner in which he sat was badly lighted, and I could not distinguish his features, but I saw that he was still looking in my direction. Nevertheless, I received no reply. At another time, I might have shown some vexation, but at that moment I was beyond it. I felt far too uncomfortable. The cold chilled me to the very marrow of my bones, and the strange smell in the carriage produced an irresistible nausea. A violent shivering fit shook my whole frame. Turning to my neighbor on the left, I asked if he would object to my opening the window. He did not utter a word, nor did he move a muscle. I repeated my question louder, but with the same result. Then I lost patience and pulled down the sash. The leather strap broke in my hand, and I noticed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mold, which had evidently been growing for years. Here my attention was drawn to the state of our carriage. I examined it more closely by the uncertain light of the outer lamp. It turned out that it was ready to fall to pieces at any moment. Everything in it was not merely out of order, but simply decayed with age. The window frames splintered at a touch. The leather linings were rotten and covered with mildew. The floor literally crumbled under my feet. In short, the whole carriage was saturated with moisture. It had apparently been taken from under some shed where it had been rotting for years, just to be used this once. I turned to the third passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and ventured to make one more remark. "This coach is in a deplorable condition," I said. "I suppose the regular carriage is being repaired, and this is a substitute." He turned his head slightly and looked me silently in the face. That look I shall remember for the rest of my life. I felt everything within me turn icy cold. I feel cold inside even now when I recall it. His eyes burned with a fierce, unnatural fire. His face was deadly pale, his lips bloodless, and his glistening teeth were bared as if in agony. The words died upon my lips. A deadly horror seized my soul. By that time, my eyes had grown accustomed to the darkness, and I could distinguish things quite well. I turned to the neighbor opposite. He, too, was looking at me, and I saw the same startling paleness, the same cold glare of the eyes. I passed my hand across my forehead, turned to the passenger sitting beside me, and saw— oh God, how can I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, that I was the only living being there. Upon their hideous faces, upon their hair damp with the dew of the grave, upon their clothes soiled with earth and rotting with age, upon their hands, the hands of corpses long buried, there flickered a pale, phosphorescent light, the phantom of decay. Living were only the eyes, their terrible eyes, and those eyes were fixed upon me with a menace. A cry of horror escaped me, a wild, inarticulate cry, a prayer for help and mercy. I threw myself upon the door and vainly attempted to open it. And in that brief moment, like a flash of lightning, vividly and clearly I saw the light of the moon through a rift in the storm clouds, the ominous road post like a warning finger uplifted, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black abyss below. The carriage rocked like a ship at sea. Then came a loud crash, unbearable pain, and finally darkness. It seemed to me that years had passed when I awoke from a deep sleep and saw my wife sitting by my bedside. I will say nothing of the scene that followed, and will tell you in a few words what she told me, while never ceasing to thank heaven with tears in her eyes for my preservation. I had fallen into the abyss not far from where the old road joins the new. I was saved from certain death only by the fact that I had fallen into a deep snowdrift at the foot of the cliff. There I was discovered when day broke by some shepherds. They carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. He pronounced it a case of concussion, delirium, a broken arm, and a compound fracture of the skull. By the letters found in my pocketbook, they established my name and address, summoned my wife, and, thanks to my youth and a strong constitution, I finally recovered. I do not know if it is necessary to say that the place of my fall was precisely the very spot where, 9 years ago, the terrible accident had happened to the mail coach. I never said a word to my wife about my hideous adventure. I told it only to the surgeon who attended me, but he treated it all as a delusion brought on by brain fever. We argued many times, and at last, finding that we could no longer contain ourselves during these discussions, we agreed to drop them. You may think what you please of this adventure, but I know for certain that 20 years ago, I was the 4th passenger in the phantom coach.